Hello everyone, today we talk about the military history of Azzone Visconti, Lord of Milan and one of the great commanders of the first half of the 14th century. We have to accelerate on medieval Milanese warfare because actually there is a lot of it. Every time I look at sort of medieval Lombardy playlist, there is enough. But when we talk about Milan in particular, we still haven't covered the wars of the Lombard League. We haven't covered such important figures in early 14th century warfare. There is a great historiographical, or at least a modest but sort of very recent historiographical attention towards these topics. It's been understood that the late Italian communal civilization was essentially the peak, not just of Italian warfare, but essentially of most of medieval warfare in comparative terms. And somehow we are stuck in this sort of loop between the classical, quote-unquote, classical golden age of the communes, that in this sense was not even technically the golden age, it was a much better period later, and the age of the condottieri, that at some point is also a bit difficult to separate from the early condottas that in fact straddled, especially like if you look at from the mid 13th century onward. And what is a condotta anyway? So none of this will be touched today because they are very heavy, dense historical and historiographical topics. But as you know, we at least made a pretty consistent amount of videos that are, in this sense, propedeutic, preparatory to this kind of more specific, in-depth research on, in this case, probably Visconti warfare, the Milanese army of the first half of the 14th century. Talking about commanders and military histories is a choice that I make in my biographical content, mostly depending on the, in fact, military relevance of a specific sovereign. There are some great warrior kings that deserve, obviously, each of these topics deserve a broader introduction and an overview. In fact, it's well possible at some point we will make also not necessarily a civil, but an all-round biography about Azzone Visconti as well. But when it comes to military history, especially for a channel like Schwerpunkt, I think it's incredibly important to explain why these figures were truly at the peak of medieval art of war development, capacity, organization, and why these names. I don't know how many of you have ever heard about Azzone Visconti, or how many have even conceptualized especially the early 14th century as the beginning properly of the Visconti conquest of Lombardy, as it's going to essentially become in these very generations the regional state that eventually will be the most powerful. In later medieval Italy, we have seen figures like Gian Galeazzo, as a matter of fact, but the Visconti are very worthily sort of useful in military history because not just of their sort of military curriculum per se, but the fact that they structured their power as a properly like imperially oriented and land grabbing oriented potentate that would essentially reach the highest level of military development in Europe. Contemporary chronicles point out that it was not normal, even for the King of France, to have constantly at some point 4, 5, even 6,000 men at arms readily available in a way or another. If you read Philippe de Comines from the later century as well, it's clearly explained that even the French kings in the mid 14th century started to, and we talk about the beginning of the establishment of a first permanent nucleus of the French royal army, were inspired to the same great hosts of the northern Italian lords, especially the Ghibelline ones, the Visconti and the Della Scala. So we may have missed historiographically entirely the fact that these powers were much more military structured even than the major national monarchies of the era, and yet there is barely any extensive research just for telling you how you think that we know medieval history, or we know medieval war. There are massive gaps everywhere, and sort of history in many ways is not much malleable per se, but it it's a process of research that obviously hasn't even began to assess, for example, in a comparative fashion or in truly a diachronic one also, the essence of given military systems across Europe. It's mostly like localized or localistic even wars studies that fundamentally occurred after World War II. And so before historiography had even started to attempt covering everything, and that especially after the war sort of delegitimized certain sort of polemiological inquiries, accusing them of fascism or nationalism. This is especially the case in continental Europe. You can imagine a country like Italy or Germany, etc. But very different to what happened in the Anglosphere, where unfortunately there were horrifying things such as culturalism, structuralism, but at least the winners of World War II had in the West like a pretty clear idea that warfare was important to be studied and researched, and at least we owe them a lot in terms of proper historiographical production, regardless of certain shortcomings, including the ones of, in fact, accentuating or not sort of approaching. It's also a matter of language. Like if you don't have a solid command of Latin, well, most scholars up to sort of this generation normally had as medievalists, but also of the Italian vernacular of this time, and especially of the immensity compared to practically any other, by scale, to any other national production of local Italian sort of documentary at large production, right? And in particular, the chronicling one. There are certain works like, I don't know, Musato's or Cermenati, etc. They're sort of very complex works to read. Vicentinus. It's not like Villani that more or less has been popularized because Florence somehow rings more of a modern bell, right? And this is a bit the problem that affects Milanese history and warfare, because in a way the great communes of northern Italy had also a quite precocious seigneurial affirmation. They never quite had a popular regime, unlike many, for example, in Tuscany, which means also that there are actually very powerful sources from the north. We just mentioned some of them, even from the same Milan, that write exceptional histories, are very dense, very informed. Again, these are by far the best documented places in the world at the time, but that are also cultured, like high, right? They have some level of stylistic choice that does not make them look at the nitty and gritty stuff that sometimes the more vernacular, popular-minded chronicles of even some random places in central Italy really had. On top of that, this is actually valid also for Naples. Like the archives of Milan were destroyed in 1943. And so this unfortunately left like an horrendous gap in documentary evidence. So we don't know as much about Milan compared to Florence, and this, again, because of all these reasons. And therefore, what we're left with, fortunately and unfortunately, however, because, again, there is also a lot of this type of content, is a lot of evidential information that is paradoxically the one that at some point historians began to abandon, because they abandoned the idea that, after all, strictly speaking, political or military events that were not relevant. And instead, so you have this contrast between the actual availability of information and the lack of interest towards properly the art of war in northern Italy. It was incredibly interesting under an enormous amount of standpoints, and I shall make more videos to various themes, because this is not just studying either, I don't know, Milan or Verona, it's also looking at a bit the wall. Now, this is true also for Tuscany, for Naples. If you look at the videos I already made on late communal Italian warfare, you know that this was an incredibly homogeneous civilization, meaning that all these city-states were very far from being some sort of disconnected and fractious wall, but on the contrary, they had basically all the same level of development of military capacity. You never see something probably differing as a, for example, tactical system that the array dispositions in this era. the first half of the 14th century, also in part like the second half of the 13th, are really crucial in this. And you have plenty of videos, especially in the topics comment down below, that will lead you to similar topics that we already in fact browsed. But today we talk about Azzone. Azzone Visconti was born in Ferrara, that, as you know, is a major center in the Romagna region, ruled by the Este family. We shall make a video about that house. It was incredibly important. On December the 7th, 1302, and he was the sole legitimate son of Galeazzo I, the son of Matteo I, and the Lord of Milan at that point, and a key figure in the early consolidation of Visconti power in Milan. Right? The question is, why wasn't Azzone born in Milan? Well, because in that year, his family was exiled from Milan, and for 10 years, the La Torre family, sponsored by the Guelphs, the Angevins, installed itself in the Ambrosian city, and sort of carried out a hunt of the Visconti avamposts, trying to curb their resistance. The Visconti were, however, well connected, and some of them, in this case Galeazzo, who was the firstborn son of Matteo, had taken refuge in Ferrara, was in fact backing the Ghibelline faction at that point. The mother of Azzone was Beatrice d'Este herself, so she belonged to the local house. She was the daughter of Obizzo II, the Marquis of Ferrara, a prominent noble in northern Italy. His birth took place during one of the darkest periods, as we have just realized, for the Visconti lineage. In June of that same year, his grandfather, Matteo I, the first Visconti to firmly establish the family's signoria over Milan as imperial vicar and captain of the people, had been expelled from Milan by the La Torre faction, the long-standing Guelph rivals who had dominated the city earlier in the 13th century after years of intermittent struggle between the two families. Matteo had already become imperial vicar. He will be, as you know, big spoiler here, we actually don't talk much about it because Azzone was still too young for his military exploit to take place, but the Visconti will be reinstalled in Milan at the arrival of the king of the Romans at that time, Henry VII of Luxembourg. And I'm also preparing not just a video on the Raumfahrt of Henry VII, but also a series on it. So for all those who are interested in the period, this is big and important. I also have a series on the first war of the Lombard League, so we are getting there, right? For all enthusiasts of different backgrounds, and I think you know what was the Visconti background. I also recently made a video about the displacement of the popolo in Milan as well as in other Italian cities, where in fact we discuss how the Visconti affirmed their own signory, and we explain how they emerged actually from a very modest background. There were some actually minor aristocratic house from Lake Como. The Archbishop Otto Visconti of Milan is the one that effectively brings his nephew Matteo on to become de facto lord, even though the institutional process of how the lordship was affirmed is sort of very gradual. So there is a lot going on in terms properly of worldview, what kind of direction the cities should follow internationally in the struggle between Guelphs and Ghibellines. There is also a very interesting contrast between the Visconti and the Torriani as far as the army of Milan is concerned. Or should this become an instrument of hegemony, and in this sense should be the massive, to say the least. Milan was, together with Paris, the largest city in Europe. As you know, a major arms and armor production, actually the finest arms and armor production center Europe at the time. It had historically led the struggle against the Hohenstaufen as the head of the Lombard League. It had a massive reputation. It's almost paradoxical that eventually would become the most Ghibelline power under the Visconti, but in fact also the international landscape had changed, the Visconti are in part overthrown because they had somehow pushed the Milanese citizenry and peasantry to keep participating, in fact, to the great model of communal military expedition, right, that involved large numbers, high proportions of cavalry, for example. And this obviously brought Milan to overwhelm many neighboring cities and to affirm, especially in its immediate medium surrounding, so to say, a proper Milanese seigneury already that under Azzone, as we will see today, will extend de facto to the wall of Lombardy and beyond, in ways that, however, had become too burdensome for the citizenry itself. This is a broader sense of collapse in the moment of stagnation of the great civilization. People don't want to make more effort anymore. They lament the idea of warfare per se. They don't see in populistic ways the opportunity that especially like the biggest city in Italy had in waging this broader hegemonic policy, right, and strategic expansion. And so the Latori actually arrive in Milan and take over by sparing the citizenry from large mobilizations, but asking them, however, still more money for more mercenary troops, but still contained a bit. The wealth block, there aren't blocks actually in history at any point for real, but I mean the wealth faction had historically been about trade, economic expansion, etc., and the Angevins themselves had not really pushed that much in terms of political interference. They usually sent some troops from the Neapolitan kingdom or the county of Provence, in this case, especially to northwestern Italy, with the Seneschal of Piedmont, and they tended, in fact, not to sort of to wage war very much. It was the idea that more third estate rule. This is not the case of Milan, but where we said again the popolo would never really ruled, if not during the incredibly brief experiment in the 15th century, the Ambrosian Republic. Is something sort of completely. This is the exception that confirms the rule for Milan. They were all sort of noblemen of the empire, by the way. That there was this connection here. The emperor had not showed up from a couple of generations anymore, even more. And so the Ghibelline faction in particular was in trouble. And the idea is that there is this balance, let's say, internal in Milan that starts seeing the Della Torre policy as probably a waste. Like they see what kind of power can be concentrated in Milan, especially with the return of the emperor, because the Luxembourg is preparing north of the Alps, and especially the great bankers of Milan and the great nobiliary families of Milan realize that if they start investing a great deal in military expeditions, especially with the best mercenaries available, and start really putting together a very sort of strong core of forces, they can fundamentally start cashing from all the other cities around. This, telling the truth, was not the prevalent attitude even by the arrival of Henry VII. It's, however, the ensuing crisis, the Guelph counterstrike after the emperor's death, that will oblige Milan to carry out some radical military reforms and to explode literally as a truly imperial force capable of rivaling with monarchies and being quite threateningly act as such in front of the other Italian powers. So the expulsion, as we've seen in 1302, had forced Galeazzo, Beatrice, and the entire immediate Visconti household that had actually been in Milan up to that point, including the newborn Azzone, to flee to the safety of Este territory, where Obizo II granted them refuge. Right. This enforced exile from Milan lasted almost a full decade. Only in 1311, when Matteo I finally recovered the lordship through a combination of military pressure, alliances with Emperor Henry VII, and shifting internal support within the city, did the family return to Milan and begin to reestablish their position among the ruling elite. Right. We will see this much better in the series about Henry VII's expedition, because there are some passages that are utterly incredible from Chronicles about all the intersection of imperial values of knighthood, of how the Visconti posited themselves as such, the role of German mercenaries, the battles with the church, with the Angevins. It's something incredible within Lombardy and beyond. Azzone's earliest documented assumption of public responsibility came at the very end of June 1322. This is a completely different situation. Following Matteo I's death, Galeazzo immediately named his 20-year-old son Lord of Piacenza. This was an important Emilian city under the Visconti influence, assigning him joint authority with Beatrice as well. The appointment was short-lived. By the final days of October, Versuzius Vergusio Landi, a prominent Piacentine noble from a family long hostile to external lordship, capitalizing on deep-seated noble discontent, especially resentment over Galeazzo's visible willingness to open peace negotiations with the Pope, secured the betrayal of one of the city gates through internal contacts. Landi entered Piacenza with several hundred armed men. Azzone and Beatrice, who were present inside the palace when the attack began, narrowly avoided capture. Beatrice ordered large quantities of coin to be thrown from the balconies and along the internal corridors, creating momentary chaos among the assailants and buying the crucial seconds needed for flight. Protected by an escort of only 12 knights, Azzone and his mother escaped the city. Landi, now in control, afterward personally arranged for Beatrice to be safely conducted beyond the boundaries of the Piacentine Contado. This is a very interesting scenario. It may sound apparently confusing, especially considering that Landi will eventually be famous, like as a wealth ruler. But here he had actually exploited like discontent existing among this Visconti-controlled city, where also the Guelphs had tried attacks that had been successfully repelled by the Milanese mercenaries due to overtures to the papacy. So at this point, Landi was actually a Ghibelline, but he would actually become a Guelph later. So this coup with some troops had not to do with the eventual introduction of papal troops later on, when Bertrand de Pouget will actually create, like in Piacenza, like a proper basis of power for the fight against the Visconti. And the broader context, as you know, and we also partially talk about this, is the crusade that the papacy had launched at this point, and being fought in Lombardy, so across Piacenza is from the other side of the Po River in the south, where the papal host had in fact established its camp in Monza, actually very close to Milan, threatening the same Visconti. This was a moment of a renewed existential threat, not very different from the one that the family had faced in 1302, or the renewed struggle that had started with the arrival of Henry VII, but also his departure, and aside from his later death in 1313, like the coming back in Lombardy of different Guelph powers that were in fact hostile to the Visconti, and at some point reorganize to strike back. And in fact, on November the 8th of the same 1322, due to discontent among uncles Marco and Lodrisio over Galeazzo's papal negotiations, armed clashes erupted inside Milan itself, forcing Galeazzo into brief exile at Lodi with the Vistarini family. Lodi is also very close to Milan, telling the truth, but for that while, Galeazzo was sort of snoozed, so to say. He regained control of the city as Lord of Milan, however, on the night, the 10th of December. Azzone's first major military engagement occurred in 1324-1325. Here, the war against the papacy was still alive, even though the Milanese had managed to strike back. And this is the moment in which, in fact, the major, the defining feature of the Milanese army, namely the backbone of German mercenary knights, or the ones left by Henry VII and others that were flocking into Italy for the good pay and the lot of war that was being fought, had switched side from the papal army to the Milanese one. Some Germans had also tried basically to completely get rid of Galeazzo, but eventually they had thought sort of against that. Also because the papal legate, yes, did use Germans, but had also lots of Gascons, and he would have sort of gladly replaced those mercenaries had they eventually passed from his side, handing Galeazzo over to him. Very complicated scenario, and we will have to make, in fact, more in-depth videos about, for example, Galeazzo I, that is sort of also an incredibly important figure. But the Viscontis here are directly involved in the best sort of nobiliar way to military lifestyle at the head of the most powerful city in Italy in this existential struggle against the Guelphs and the Papals. Already in July 1324, at 22, Azzone had been entrusted by Galeazzo with Piacenza's government and led a relief force of 800 cavalry reinforced by infantry and crossbowmen to raise the papal siege of Castione de' Marchesi in the Parmesan district. These operations are really typical, right? Whenever I make these videos, especially if they're very biographical, for example, the one I made on Edward III was also contemporary, obviously, and so it shows you more or less how Europeans were fighting actually in the same ways across Europe at the time. The one on Edward III was not strictly biographical, it talked more about the sort of the English army of the 100 Years' War as Edward III had sort of fully completed its establishment, so to say, that naturally passes through his campaigns and victories. But in these biographies instead, whenever they are of the military type, I tend to add properly every single action that we know of. Obviously, if information, it's not that easy to find, but that's why we are on Schwerpunkt, we're not somewhere else, and we find it. And so you can appreciate the range, like properly the normality and continuity of this military life. So these people spent their lifetime on horseback, right? And it's something utterly insane compared to anything that we witness in today's lifestyle, even in the military. Now, although too late to save the castle, Azzone occupied Borgo San Donnino, Fidenza, and held it with Parmesan exiles and German knights. Right, but Fidenza was essentially this frontier town, fortified stronghold with at the border with the same Piacenza, and historically was surrounded by the Pallavicini estates that were historically a bit more aristocratically detached from Parma. When Castruccio Castracani, and actually, big spoiler, I'm preparing a video about him, it's probably going to last 2 hours and a half of the same military biographical type. As you know, he was the Lord of Lucca, and a major Ghibelline leader at that point, properly the head of the entire coalition, especially against Florence in Tuscany, requested aid against the, in fact, Guelph coalition led by Ramon of Cardona, that some of you asked me to make a video on. Galeazzo agreed in return for 16,000 florins, which was a great sum, right? Some cities were bought for tens of thousands of gold florins. But already at this point, the Visconti had the best knights out there. German mercenaries, professionally salaried, so to say. At this point, the Visconti had cracked on any kind of mutiny. The Germans in Milan from now on will be absolutely faithful to the Visconti. And the Visconti contribution, and especially Azzone's participation in this sense, to the 1325 campaign of Altopascio is crucial, as we will see now, in inflicting the second largest defeat after Montecatini, carried out in large part also at the time, thanks at least to the contribution of German knights against Florence. We're talking about the Battle of Altopascio. In April 1325, Azzone, accompanied by the uncle Marco, marched south from the Po Valley into Tuscany with this 800, 1200, it depends on the sources, heavy cavalry. It's a pretty sizable contingent. Again, 16,000 florins in such a delicate political and strategic moment were, after all, well invested by Castruccio. Almost entirely, again, German mercenaries, hired at high price, headed towards their allies in Tuscany. We'll surely make more videos about German mercenaries during this year because, as you know, you find them pretty much everywhere, right? At the head of Denmark, siding with the French, like as we've seen also in the Battle of Poitiers video. On September the 23rd, 1325, Azzone commanded the Ghibelline vanguard at the Battle of Alto Pascio, or at least, yeah, he was among the in the battle line that we don't have so many different details actually about the actual composition of the main battle line of Castruccio's army, and we know, however, that the Ghibelline heavy cavalry charge was overwhelming. The Guelphs were basically stunned, and they seemingly, Villani tells us, like remained, they petrified in front of the collapse of their own cavalry in particular, so that the infantry actually put up some resistance, but they were sort of done for in an hour. We are near the village of the same name in Tuscany. The Castruccio's army was encamped uphill at Monte Carlo. Azzone's detachment absorbed the first violent impact of Cardona's Burgundian mercenaries, because the Francophones were mostly from the Guelph side at this point, holding ground under intense pressure and thereby preserving the cohesion of the main body long enough for Castruccio to unleash the decisive countercharge. Again, we don't know exactly how the battle unfolded, but we know that there were multiple battle lines, and we have sort of an idea of the there is also an interpretation of how you read the sort of the composition of battle line, if it is meant to be in depth or segmented. I will not digress into this. Perhaps at some point we will make a video about the Battle of Alto Pascio. All what matters is that the context is fully coherent with, of course, like the massive charge head-on of the German knights under Azzone, that distinguished himself in combat. This was something sort of drastically impacting probably the cohesiveness of the enemy formation. The Florentine Guelph line, in fact, collapsed rapidly. Among the prisoners taken were the same Ramon of Cardona himself, his son William, his nephews Guy and Raymond, numerous French barons, 40 of the most prominent Florentine knights as well. Florence had actually invested an enormous lot in this host, 50 Transalpine captains, and 20 leading Tuscans. So this was actually a massive Guelph debacle, because these are probably the creme of the Guelph Tuscan provincial establishment fighting in Tuscany against Lucca and Pisa under Castruccio, who collected this massive victory. Castruccio also was one of the greatest commanders of the time, yet he needed, as we've seen here, Milanese power in order to defeat Florence. Total Guelph casualties, dead and captured, approach 5,000. The entire enemy camp, complete with tents, baggage trains, and all equipment, fell intact into Ghibelline hands, so there was also a great material gain from this in a direct sense. Because you imagine the magnificence. There is a beautiful passage by Villani that lists probably all the mounts, all the servants, all what they had brought with their wagons. And the battle in and of itself is quite fascinating, because at some point the Guelph army was starting to disgregate itself because of moral issues. They were actually starting to depart as the battle began. You would imagine sort of battles quite stereotypically, sort of lines head-on, all sure what is going to happen. No, like at some point the Guelphs, even the infantrymen, make some sort of they wheel about around in front of the camp, the Ghibelline camp uphill, It seems, and they come back to Florence. It seems, by the way, that also from the Ghibelline side, infantry remained largely on the mountain, and so you have this marked increase. This is typical, in fact, of the mid-20s of this period in the affirmation of heavy cavalry, especially these Transalpine mercenaries from both sides, plus naturally the regular Italian nobiliary complement, but ever less involved in quantity, because Italian society, as we've seen, was also becoming rapidly oligarchic, and that's also the reason why they could afford so many foreign mercenaries after all. What is interesting and pertains specifically to Azzone's knights is that during the pursuit, or actually likely before the same battle, 2 German squadrons of the Milanese detached, in fact, under Azzone's direct orders, seized the Cappiano Bridge over the Guisciana stream, blocking the main escape route of the Guelphs, in fact, causing many fugitives to drown while attempting to ford the river in panic, right? And German knights were often used in this function, not just with their mass, like to charge like the rest of heavy cavalry, but to also be sent for specifically ad hoc tasks, like also suicide missions, try to attack and kill the enemy captain in melee. This happened, for example, this was attempted at the Battle of Luco Cisterna against the Infante of Aragon in the same peasant army. You have, which is around these years, as a matter of fact, you have but also, and especially like in this case, the flank attack, like the idea of a hidden detachment. They could have traveled for even tens of kilometers before the battle, positing themselves somewhere nasty, like here, occupying the only escape route, basically on a normal road on the bridge, and therefore exponentially increasing the number of casualties and prisoners on the enemy side. Right, flank attacks had been performed also in a fully integrated and coordinated combined armed tactics at the Battle of Montecatini, at Pontetetto. So actually, even though we don't know much about Altopascio in the same level of detail, that gets often described because there have been important Anglo-American authors who wrote about Florentine history. Castruccio is also, as you know, publicized by Machiavelli later on. So that's mostly the reason why, for example, the Battle of Altopascio is so famous, whereas the one of Zappolino, as we'll see now in the same year, is sort of less like people tend to know less that context in the Bolognese, etc. But the result of technicality of this warfare is incredibly fascinating, and we will surely make the battle videos on it because they are incredibly important. Now, contemporary accounts emphasize that the arrival of Azzone's essentially around 1,000 German heavy cavalry crucially shifted the balance, allowing Castruccio to move from defensive posturing to offensive action towards Florence. And they will come to raid, in fact, up to the Florentine suburbs at that point, a bit like had happened after yet another sort of dismay, the aftermath of a catastrophe like Montecatini. Some chroniclers divide credit for the victory equally between Castruccio and Azzone, interestingly enough, underlying the young Visconti's personal role in holding the critical first line against the Burgundian shock troops. Immediately after the victory at Altopascio, Azzone transferred his operations into Emilia, actually in Romagna, aligning with Rinaldo II d'Este, the Marquis of Ferrara, that, as we've seen, was a relative, and Passerino Bonacolsi, that we described in the video we made about the Gonzagas, because at least this was the Mantuan lord known as his name was Rinaldo, telling the truth, Bonacolsi, and he was eventually killed by the Gonzagas as proxies of the La Scala to properly establish eventually the sort of long-lasting Gonzaga lineage in power in Mantua. In fact, this ongoing campaign against Bologna staunched Guelph City. Right. So basically, after Altopascio, some noblemen in the Bolognese Apennine rebelled to the Guelph regime of the city because, again, the Ghibellines had scored this big victory, and so they captured Monteveglio, that was a fortress in the Apennines. It's sort of pretty sort of mountainous, hilly terrain, and the Bolognese carry out this massive military fort. The Bolognese were very popular, were very wealth-minded. We've seen it also in the recent video about the longevity of the populace in Bologna. And they have this sort of still old style by these decades now, communal army with 30,000 men, mostly footmen, and the idea that there is a civic integrity, that can't be a lordship, right? Whereas all these lords, the Visconti, the Bonacolsi, there are also the Della Scala fighting together in this coalition, are all these great lords of Lombardy, Ghibelline, that want to encroach on that wealth, liberty, so to say. And in Bologna, it was such an important city, very much allied with Florence. So basically, Azzone goes over to the Este camp, is hosted there, and interestingly enough, the Florentines that also sent some help to the Bolognese, and even paid for it, because they were left to defend a position that was stormed at night by a surprise, a sudden attack of the Ghibellines over a ridge. There's an incredibly interesting feint maneuver the day before, as if the host that had come to help the besieged Montevideo withdrew, right? And at night they came back and they stormed this ridge, actually, and the Florentine knights there put up an intense fight, but at night they're also overwhelmed just by the numbers. And the Florentines had told the Bolognese, look, those 800 German knights under Azzone have basically, broken our rear side at Alto Pascio. Do not give battle. Do not give battle to them, because obviously, again, this is how medieval battles were fought. Mostly, like, somebody came to break a siege, and sort of they gave each other sort of battle on a suitable ground. And obviously, as it happened, by the way, if the Bolognese had been defeated, the same Florentines would have further heavily suffered, because that would have been a second major defeat. 1325 is the worst year for the Guelphs in this sense, which had never really happened. Like, there haven't been a year in which catastrophic battles had been of regional scale, with armies of tens of thousands of men had been fought in the same year, just even for having the same outcome for the Guelph Ghibelline party, respectively. And instead, in fact, on November the 15th, 1325, Azzone commanded several cavalry detachments at the Battle of Zappolino, because the Ghibelline army managed at night to cross this wall that the Bolognese and their allies had maintained, and to present themselves in open ground next to the Bolognese army that does give battle, and that had rushed on the battle. This was all programmed. It was a master stroke, by the way, of strategy and maneuver, operational skills, and so on. Only the great Ghibelline lords of the north at this point could do. They anticipated that the Bolognese army, larger but less professional, would have been more disorderly. And you have this climatic engagement is mostly famous for the War of the Oaken Bucket, this clash that was depicted also because of Tassone's play in the 18th century, as rooted in this long, as it was, like, for this matter, in long-standing Modenese Bolognese rivalry, allegedly stemming from this bucket that was stolen. They used to do this stuff, like they stole chains, bells, or something like that. But I mean, the reasons why they were fighting against one another were much bigger on a regular basis. So people say, oh, look, so many people died. You still find these very strange videos on YouTube that never talk about any of this context, although the many battles that were fought at this point were even more important and bigger. But because of the narrative, look at how many of these guys died just because of a bucket. That's literally the videos that exist out there. This is absolutely insulting. But this, in fact, would escalate into a major Guelph-Ghibelline clash. And despite facing an overall numerical disadvantage, contemporary sources indicate the Ghibellines disposed of forces roughly 1/4 the size of their Bolognese opponents. This is at least counting especially the infantry that, as we've seen, was not particularly useful. But in terms of cavalry, actually, the Ghibellines were superior, and this is critical, and they were superior thanks to Azzone's German knights. In fact, we estimate something between 24 to 2,500 Guelph cavalry and up to 30,000 infantry against 2,800 Ghibelline cavalry, predominantly German, and several thousand infantry, at least from the side of the Ghibellines. And in spite of this disproportion, the coalition achieved a crushing success because the disproportion was numerical but not sort of moral and therefore substantial, right? By the way, the interesting aspect of this story is that the battle is also less. It's more like what leads to the battle in terms of operations is really sort of eye-opening about sort of this late communal Italian warfare. We know very few about the clash between the battle lines. It's a bit like at Alto Pascio, right? We know much more about the entire leading up to the battle, lots of details about the army, etc. But in many ways, this reminds me of von Clausewitz's statement that war, after all, is very hard, but it's actually also very simple from a strategic standpoint. It's not overly complicated. It's just people that don't understand it think it's overly complicated. But these guys literally smash into one another with the battle lines. In our chronicles were so habituated to telling those stories that to them, it's really normal that this clash to occur that way. We don't know of the infantry wings that likely existed, etc. But we know of a flank attack that also here, I forgot to say that about Alto Pascio, we don't know whether there was a flank attack. We're not told really. But in my opinion, it's likely that there was, because if you scratch the sources, just sort of you look at the battlefield, like sort of create an idea, it's perfectly possible that this was the case. At Zappolino, we're sure of that. And there is an Italianate name, that's surely the one of a German constable, that is Gangalando, which naturally sounds for the idea of gang and land, something like that. So the one that goes through the land or something, etymologically. That is a guy from the retinue of the Este Lord that in that moment was also using, in fact, German mercenaries. And we don't know whether this reserve of 200 Germans that attacked from a valley, a little valley is just next to the battlefield. When you look at these battlefields, I personally experienced it with Markfeld, but you can look at all these battlegrounds on Google Maps, Google Streets. You can immediately spot there is always a perfect place where to launch a concealed attack from. Here in Zappolino is probably in the entire history of warfare the best that I've ever seen. It may be sort of even better than Tagliacozzo's, even though Tagliacozzo was in fact a much bigger battle line, so it was something slightly different, but nevertheless not easier to perform. And so we don't know how many of Azzone's Germans performed in this case, because as we've seen also the rest of cavalry was also German, but they contributed to almost 1/3 from Milan. So it's really interesting. And the coalition achieved a crushing success. There is the Chronicon Estense, that is admittedly a later source that depicts the Este claiming some sort of overlordship over all the Germans in the army, because these Ghibelline leaders, as Holy Roman Imperial feudatories, thought to be somehow entitled to that German connection. This is something that at some point also Ludwig of Bavaria in these years tries, like that all the Germans, because they were Germans, had to respond to him, not even just as Holy Roman Emperor, but yes, as as the greatest lord from Central Europe. And these Italians were telling him basically they had more Germans at their service because simply they were richer, and that's why the Germans had come there to begin with than the same emperor. This is a literal, at some point, letter was sent to Ludwig as he was about to enter Italy, as we will see now, by the way, because it sort of affects Azzone's government as well. Azzone and Rinaldo thus played this important role. It should be pointed out that Cangrande was there. This is the age of all these great commanders. When he heard that Azzone was coming, he came back to Verona. He left the soldiers there at the siege, in the army to break the siege, but he went away because the Visconti and the Della Scala actually hated each other. They were both, as you know, imperial vicars of their respective provinces, but appointed by Henry VII, but they were also very competitive with one another. Never sort of went at full war against one another in this period, but there was a lot of tension. They couldn't really stand one another. Also, Azzone and Rinaldo overcame Passerino's initial reluctance and convinced him to commit his full strength. This was also a coalition problem, and you see also the foresight of these commanders, the moral force of gambling everything, because they had literally to pass across this ridge, this fortified emplacement at night with a feint, and the day before. It's something incredibly risky. Like if you lose hundreds of German knights, you're going to have a lot of problems in the immediate aftermath. But they coordinated this brilliantly, to say the least. This is even actually more interesting than Alto Pascio. And their coordinated charges eventually on the field broke the Bolognese fort. And even here, we know they lasted a few. We know that sort of they fought, because there were many. They weren't just captured; they actually were killed in combat. And it was an incredibly deep sort of Bolognese defeat. The rout carried the fleeing Guelph troops as far as Borgo Panicale, only 2 miles from the walls of Bologna itself. Bolognese dead and prisoners numbered close to 3,000. Out of something like 30,000. So interesting for telling you that how much of a myth, especially if you look at the spirit of Italian warfare, the idea that medieval armies were small. They were routinely large in these regional clashes. In deliberate mockery, Azzone organized 3 palii to be run directly beneath the city gates, one reserved for knights, one for foot soldiers, and one for prostitutes. This was normal. It happened also under the walls of Florence. At a point, the palio is in this sense, a defilade right in front of the enemy walls, saying like, we are here, you can't do anything. You have shut yourself inside your walls because we are too strong, and we can't even have not just the knights, but the footmen, so lesser people, and then the prostitutes, so in the most outrageous way, pass by because you're worthless. All right, it's very difficult to capture the hatred existing in these struggles, but if you widen this from a sort of local rivalry that definitely did exist, but into a more sort of regional, even national, international one, you understand it better. And this, in fact, Azzone did also because it explicitly imitated the humiliating gesture that Castruccio had staged outside Florence earlier that year, as we've seen after Alto Pascio. And so that the same 800 German cavalry that had proved crucial in that battle 2 months earlier formed the core of the Ghibelline mounted force at Zappolino, again hired at high cost, this time by Passerino Bonacolsi, because this was not done for free, even though they were allies, as we've seen with the same Castruccio. But again, yet again, tipping the balance in a confrontation dominated by cavalry, despite the Bolognese numerical superiority in infantry. In February 1327, Azzone, again accompanied by Marco, attended the diet convened at Trento by Ludwig the Bavarian, the would-be, here he was king of the Romans, so would-be Holy Roman Emperor Louis IV, that I also made a biographical video last autumn about, who opposed, as you know, at this point, Pope John XXII, and so to assert imperial authority in Italy. John XXII had been the same one that had excommunicated the Visconti, had declared them heretical. There was all a black legion regarding the same sort of cults practice, black statues, sort of rites on the tomb of the bishop Otto we mentioned before. These were largely made up, but we'll never know what they meant by that. As you know, there were also certain occult practices of chivalry that were going on that the church looked upon with suspicion, to say the least. And so, in fact, the same emperor is excommunicated. The Visconti obviously are playing with him, but actually they suffer from the arrival of Ludwig. In fact, tensions between Ludwig and Galeazzo quickly escalated after the latter discreetly reopened peace negotiations, as he had already done, as we've seen before, under such pressure with the Pope through the intermediary Giovanni Morigia, that is a Monzese, also chroniclers for that matter. So, you know, this is how involved in the direct politics. It's how sort of beautiful actually their work really is when you look at narrative sources in this period. In early July, Azzone, Galeazzo, Lucchino was Azzone's uncle and future co-ruler, and Giovanni, another uncle, Archbishop of Milan, were arrested by the Wittelsbach and imprisoned in the ovens of Monza Castle, interestingly enough. All this because the Wittelsbach needed money, and he, differently from his Luxembourg predecessor, he was a very opportunistic, shrewd, and effective sort of entrepreneur, let's put it in this way. So he wanted just to get the Roman crown, the imperial crown in Rome, and squeezing as much as he could from out of Italian city-states, right? And so the Visconti, that actually were the richest, the most powerful at this point, were thanks to, through the expedition here that was agglutinating ever larger amount of knights, like temporarily suppressed by the Bavarian. They remained confined in Monza until March the 25th of 1328, when sustained pressure from Castruccio Castracani finally secured their release. We'll see how. Castruccio had been allied with the Wittelsbach, and he had been sort of asking for hash money and obtaining titles, very prestigious ones, including the white and blue checkered sort of heraldry on his own Antelminelli ensign, like from the same Wittelsbach. They were friends, right? But he also cared very much about the Visconti, because he knew that when Ludwig would have come back to Germany, those were the greater allies. Azzone then followed the emperor himself into Tuscany, right? The Bavarian descends from Lombardy to Tuscany, heading to Rome, where he was received with considerable splendor by Castruccio in Lucca before joining Galeazzo at the siege of Pistoia. So there are a series of Tuscan cities, including, as we'll see now, Pisa, that are heavily pressured by the Bavarian, that want some ransom for the city's safety. And Castruccio becoming a bit like the handler of this Tuscan rare lines as the Bavarian goes over to Rome. Galeazzo contracted a serious illness beneath the walls of Pistoia and died on August the 6th, 1328 at Pesce. Galeazzo's death left Visconti authority at its absolute lowest point in terms of political control. Imperial vicars and local families openly hostile to the lineage had, by the way, taken control of most centers previously tied to Visconti influence. Milan itself was governed by the imperial vicar left by the Bavarian, William of Montfort, supported by a council of 24 citizens expressly chosen for their opposition to the Visconti, but quite ad hoc, obviously. Naturally, you couldn't simply eradicate, again, a house of this kind in the extension of its power. Everybody knew that, naturally, the Bavarians' fate was tied to a very thin thread. Azzone immediately entered into open rivalry with his uncle Marco for dominance over Milan. In fact, this was incredibly important because it wasn't a pre-established succession system. This was not yet properly a dynasty in the successory, almost monarchic sense. Milan is not yet the duchy that they will be able to buy the title of from the Luxembourgs later on. But in this sense, it allows, also thanks to the communal institutional system, some level of fluidity or flexibility in regime. On January the 15th, 1329, in fact, Azzone purchased the same imperial vicariate of Milan from the same Ludwig for 60,000 florins. Some sources cite higher figure of 125,000, but it's unlikely. But already 60,000 was immense. Like, again, at some point, cities were bought for less, paying only, in fact, in the moment, 12,000 immediately and agreeing to monthly installments of 1,000. And so it would have taken quite a while, to 5 years, or actually less if you subtract the 12,000, to extinguish as a debt. Marco handed over as hostage to the German troops to guarantee fulfillment of the payment, by the way, by Azzone, re-entered Milan on August the 14th, 1329, but was found dead on September the 5th in a narrow alley beside the old Broletto, that was the heart of Milanese politics. The chronicler Scorio, that is admittedly like a Renaissance author, but that knew some sources that we unfortunately are lost today, that would, however, add little to the matter. And Villani, however, that is the most famous one at the time, explicitly attribute the suffocation and subsequent defenestration to orders given by Azzone, Lucchino, and Giovanni, stressing Marco's well-established reputation for martial valor. As a matter of fact, it was yet another important commander in the Visconti house. His repeated public threats, however, directed against Azzone as well, and the severe danger his continued presence thus represented to the fragile reconsolidation of Visconti power. The conferral of the imperial vicariate provoked an immediate and severe reaction from Pope John XXII, who pronounced excommunication against Azzone, imposed interdict upon the city of Milan, and threatened direct military intervention by French allies. But it wouldn't change much, especially with the Bavarians still in Italy. In fact, in the spring of 1329, Ludwig the Bavarian marched into Lombardy back from the south, with a clear intention at that point of reestablishing direct imperial authority. And so this is sort of a strange experiment. It fails, but he first laid siege to Monza, and as such also to Milan, ideally, but found himself unable to cross the Lambro River from the eastern bank because the river was exceptionally swollen at that point. Redirecting his forces westward to Agliata in order to use the bridge there, because around Milan, as you know, there is all a set of canals, of riverways that had been built also from quite a while at this point. It was an incredibly complicated territory. We think the Po Valley is all flatland, right? Aside from the forests that still were there, the swamps, etc., but even the canals were something that complicated really maneuvers, and the Milanese there knew very well how to use this stuff. The Bavarian renewed the assault from the opposite direction, but still failed to breach the defenses. Naturally, the defenses that were all manned by the Milanese. Turning his attention to Milan itself, Ludwig initially encamped beside the Archetto Bridge outside Porta Giovia, so the Gate of Jupiter, by the way. Speaking of Montjoie Saint-Denis, who knows, in my videos, before shifting his position to the Pusterla of St. Ambrose on June the 11th. Multiple attempts to seize the mills outside the Ticino Gate aimed at cutting off the city's grain supply and starving it into submission proved unsuccessful. Deserted by the majority of his Ghibelline allies, with Cangrande della Scala, the powerful lord of Verona, remaining virtually the only significant exception, as we said before for a reason, Ludwig abandoned the campaign and withdrew to Pavia on June the 19th. On September the 23rd, he formally confirmed Azzone in the vicariate in exchange for an immediate payment of yet other 12,000 florins, continuing monthly remittances, as we were saying before, and the permanent obligation to provide 200 German soldiers for imperial service whenever required. This is incredibly interesting. I mean, the German emperor asking to a Milanese to provide the emperor with 200 German soldiers. Given this tells you how many German soldiers exist. I tried to calculate this at some point, but we're talking at least several thousands, or only, but even more. Like they were in the tens of thousands altogether in Italy at this point. At least surely more than 10,000. Because, by the way, the Guelphs were starting to hire them as well. So the Florentines at some point they start hiring not much just the Neapolitan ones, the French ones in Naples, but also the properly French and German noblemen north of the Alps autonomously. And there's an incredibly fascinating context here in relation with sort of various alignments that now will start to occur even between former enemies. So there are some alliances between certain Guelphs and certain Ghibellines. During the defense of Monza and Milan, Pinalla Liprandi and Martino Liprandi, these were some Monzese noblemen, played key roles, with 500 Visconti knights seizing the keys to Monza's Porta de' Gradi on April 17th and isolated the imperial governor Ludwig of Teck in the castle through field fortifications. This is, again, incredibly interesting because it's a thickly urbanized, like, these cities are also very close to one another. So in between, these are actually the single most advanced parts of Europe, or the single most advanced part of Europe. And so infrastructurally, we would have been shocked by how thickly fortified, populated, etc. these places really were. And this German constable is effectively besieged and sort of cut off. At the same time, Azzone pursued a separate but parallel path of reconciliation with the papacy. Because in spite of all, like, prolonged excommunication, interdict, it was sort of useless. Relying on the mediation of his mother Beatrice and Obizzo III d'Este, the Marquis of Ferrara and Azzone's cousin, that technically was part of the Papal States, Azzone conducted discreet negotiations, also not to act too much as the Ghibelline ruler that tried to ask pardon from the papacy, or at least to broker a deal with him. Fully aware, in fact, both of the arrogance that had marked earlier German imperial descents into Italy, so the Milanese had paid firsthand what it meant to allow these German expeditions against the same papacy, after all, and of the harsh reality of the imprisonment, in fact, suffered at Monza himself. On September the 15th, 1329, the Visconti, as a consequence, obtained solemn absolution at Avignon. I recently made a video on the Avignonese papacy, on condition that they formally recognize John the 22nd as the legitimate pontiff, restore all properties confiscated from the Torriani and from the Milanese archiepiscopal see, refrain from imposing any form of taxation upon ecclesiastical goods, and abstain from initiating war against any castle or city belonging to the Holy See. The interdict that had weighed upon Milan was formally lifted. Thus, this was very important because with the interdict, technically other cities couldn't even trade with you. This, naturally, for Milan was even worse than for other cities. And the interdict is lifted. We are on May the 14th, 1330. And in the former February, St. Valentine's Day, the Pope ordered the Milanese clergy who had been compelled to leave the city during the war to return as well. Right. In fact, 1 month later exactly, the Podestà of Milan, Guiscardo da Grumello, convened the General Council in the New Broletto. This was the local council of Milan. Azzone was acclaimed there as perpetual general lord of Milan, and its entire district by a commanding majority of the 900 councillors present. It's a pretty big council as well, with full sort of almost complete majority on the occasion. The principal communal statutes, the Statuta Communis Mediolani, the Statuta Mercatorum Mediolani, and the Statuta Mercatorum Facentium Laborarem in Lanam in Civitate Mediolani, were reconfirmed. Yet the critical prerogatives of taxation, declaration of war or peace, administration of public revenues, and minting of coinage were in practice subordinated to his explicit approval. In this way, Azzone assumed pleno jure the exercise of mero et mixto imperio over both the urban center and the surrounding comitatus. This political, institutional, social precondition was instrumental to a recovery of all those territories that had been lost during these decades of crazy war. All right. From 1330, Azzone launched, in fact, an unrelenting program of territorial expansion. In the autumn of that year, he met John of Bohemia, the King John the later Blind, who sought to expand Luxembourg influence in Italy. At Brescia, presenting the Luxembourg ruler with lavish gifts designated to neutralize any immediate threat, then receiving him with appropriate ceremony at Vimercate during the latter's journey toward Como. There's all a story that we partially resumed in the video about his son Charles, who was in fact, in Italy with him. John of Bohemia was more of an errant knight than a proper monarch. Like, he fought, interestingly enough, pretty much everywhere, from Italy to Lithuania, from Bohemia to France, where, as you know, he will die at the Battle of Crécy, almost with his son. There is a lot of Italian connection there, because also the Duke of Athens actually was killed in that battle. We talk about the Germans. So it is a crucible of history in many ways. And this arrival of the Luxembourg, in theory, in the vest of sort of the next ruler, because here, as we've seen also in the video from Ludwig IV, rule was contested. There were lots of issues in Central Europe to begin with. But the idea, in fact, was creating, probably like in a fairy tale scenario, like as an errant knight arriving in northern Italy and trying to create some sort of state, but with incredibly scarce resources. Actually, the reason why Azzone and John had met in Brescia is that Brescia had offered this pretext to the King of Bohemia to save them. Like, Brescia was, one of these 30 Italian city-states, was in Lombardy. It was a relatively minor one, but still, for a king to simply arrive, as we've seen before, Ludwig had arrived without much of a following. He had asked the same Italians to provide him with German knights. John is even less. So this decrease from the time of Henry VII, that was also, in fact, John's father, to this time, it's a sort of unforgiving, really, in a historical perspective. This is really the decades before the great crisis of the Black Death, where the world was already shrinking in scale. However, John had, paradoxically, even though he was a representative of some sort of Germanic power, and that had historically, in fact, been a Ghibelline Imperial one, like, he actually allies himself with Bertrand de Pouget, that is the papal legate, as we've seen before, had fought against the Milanese in Lombardy. From there, had moved to Bologna. And so this other northern Italian, and it's actually the same Ghibelline signories of the region, are upset because they think that if these two unite, power can be a problem. So there are various leagues that are constituted. Milan is a bit out of scope because nor the papal legate from Bologna nor John can't really do much against this resurgent Milanese power. But Azzone wants to do things wisely, and he succeeds. Also, in August 1331, Azzone concluded an alliance with Theodore I, the Marquess of Montferrat. This was a Palaiologan. Right? I don't know if you've ever heard the story of the Palaiologans of Montferrat. It's very interesting. He had come probably from the Byzantine Empire to even fight in Italy at some point. He also wrote a military manual that is interesting to read, but it's also very sort of Byzantinely stylistic rather than sort of practical, especially in the Middle Ages. There weren't such things like manuals that were conceived to be actually expandable for real warfare. You didn't need manuals to know how to fight evenly. And the alliance between the Palaiologans and the Visconti was explicitly directed against Robert of Anjou, that also made a biography on. This was King Robert the Wise of Naples, and therefore also against the Angevin possessions in northwestern Italy, mostly in Piedmont, reinforced with Provence, that were a bit like one of the thorns in the side of the Visconti. If you're interested in that, I made a video about medieval Asti that tells how eventually Visconti will take over, in fact, the part of Piedmont. On August the 8th, 1331, at Castelbaldo, Azzone joined Mastino della Scala, who was the successor to Cangrande as Lord of Verona. He had died in 1329. 1329, everybody dies, like Cangrande, Castruccio, Sciarra, Colonna. And at that point, Obezo III d'Este and Ludovico I Gonzaga, Lord of Mantua, formed together with Azzone and Mastino a defensive league aimed squarely at countering the ambitions of John of Bohemia, that again had taken this contact with Bertrand de Pouget. The confederation expanded rapidly to include even the Guelph Republic of Florence, And that's what I was talking about when you see these unorthodox alliances. These cities of Como and Novara, and that were in any case gravitating around the Visconti's orbit, and ultimately the kingdom of Naples itself, receiving tacit support from Ludwig the Bavarian at the same time, was then actively engaged in fact hostilities against Bohemian territories in Central Europe. And we'll look at those theaters because they're fascinating. Again, in the biography of Ludwig, we partially talked about this. Active military campaigning began in August 1332. Mastino della Scala quickly occupied Brescia. So this was Lombardy. So in a way, there was this tacit sphere of influence where the Della Scala had historically controlled as lords like the northeastern Italian world, and Lombardy mostly fell in the hands of the Visconti, right? So the occupation of Brescia, that was, by the way, the same threat that the city had called John to express it, to avert, is an affront to Azzone. Wu captures Bergamo, that is also the rival city of Brescia, and it is also they're very close to Milan itself, so it's really, geographically speaking, also like a quite direct threat. Where on September the 20th, 1332, Azzone establishes in Bergamo a regime that deliberately permitted the coexistence of local Guelph and Ghibelline factions. This after, admittedly, a hard-fought battle in which many of both sides perished. This is local memory and the Chronicon Estense record, which makes sense because in times of crisis, normally what happened is that they tended to recall exiles to reconciliate because they realized that divided were done for. All right. So this paradoxically happened even, I remember in Siena where at the arrival of Henry VII's Germans in 1315 after the Battle of Montecatini, paradoxically, the Sienese Guelph government recalls the Ghibellines home and other exiles because they said, at least we are Sienese, right? If these Germans arrive, even if there are Ghibellines, these were mostly signed actually with the city. In all this, again, Azzone was waging war, like to subjugate different centers. Treviglio submitted voluntarily, also in part here to escape probably somebody else's dominance, because that's what also motivates in a broader moral sense these signories. Like if you can't defend yourself, you will ask for somebody's protection. In October, Lodrisio, that was Azzone's cousin and a rival branch member, seized Pavia through collaboration with the local Beccaria family, although the citadel continued to resist until the summer of 1333. A testament, by the way, to the loyalty to the Visconti in this core land, of Milan in this case, because it was yet another Visconti, even though making leverage on some autonomy, in fact, later, in this core lands of Lombardy. On November 22nd, the Castelbaldo allies divided the newly conquered territories. Bergamo, Cremona, so Castelbaldo is the name of the league there, that we listed before. So Bergamo, Cremona, and Fidenza were assigned to Azzone. All right, so you have this bridge fundamentally across the Po River. So you have an eastern belt from Bergamo in the subalpine area to Cremona and on the Po Valley, and Fidenza in the Parmesan district. I'm also made a video about medieval Parma and medieval Cremona if you're interested in the story. Parma went to Mastino, however. This is very interesting because the Della Scala are massively expanding. They're not as powerful as the Visconti, but they have, in part because of the fear that the centers have of the Visconti, is the opportunity of becoming lords of some of those cities. But their objective is Tuscany, paradoxically. Reggio goes to the Gonzaga, that were actually of Reggian origins, as we've seen in the recent video on them. And that's just across the Po River from Mantua. Modena to the Este, that is closer there. And look to Florence. There's all a background to these cities that now I'm not going to digress on, but it was important. What is really important here to point out is the repartition of spheres of influence. That evidently does not inspire also a great deal of stability. Giovanni Visconti, who had already held the Archbishopric of Novara since 1329, entered that city in 1332, rapidly secured the loyalty of prominent families such as the Cavallazzi, imprisoned the rival Tornielli, and obtained designation as Lord, as Signore. The Pope shortly afterward appointed him administrator of the revenues belonging to the Milanese archiepiscopal see. In January 1333, John of Bohemia returned to Italy at the head of 800 knights, this time something more consistent, reaching Parma on February 26th and Pavia on March the 14th. He provided unable to lift either siege, though. He then turned to ravaging the Milanese contado in the hope of forcing Azzone into open battle, an expectation that went unfulfilled, before attempting Bergamo without success and eventually agreeing to a truce. When the Este urgently requested military assistance to expel papal contingents that had advanced to the immediate vicinity of Ferrara's walls, Azzone dispatched 600 knights under the command of Pinalla Aliprandi. On April the 14th, 1333, the Ghibelline forces won a crushing victory at Porta San Pietro, capturing a large number of wealthy nobles, including the Count of Armagnac, who was compelled to ransom himself for 50,000 florins. This was French high nobility. In June, the Pavia citadel garrison, as we were remembering before, finally surrendered. By late summer, John and his son Charles had returned to Germany. In 1334, the papal legate Bertrand du Pouget, expelled from Bologna, withdrew to Avignon and urged John XXII to renew both excommunication and interdict against the Visconti, because now, with the Bohemians out of the way and this sort of papal undermining with expulsion from Bologna, like the greatest power by far was the Visconti in the region. Also, the La Scala were quite relevant, and so this was an inch Ghibelline power in the north that the Pope from Avignon had to curb in some way. At this point, Vercelli tendered voluntary submission. We are in March of the same year, so you see the surrounding cities are falling in the hands of Azzone. Cremona, governed by Ponzino Ponzoni, withstood a coalition army of 30,000 men drawn from Milan and its allies from late April through the first days of May. The defenders concluded a truce stipulating surrender if John of Bohemia failed to bring relief within 2.5 months. So there was always this idea that, in theory, that the Luxembourgs could reintervene. This is a very interesting triangle because the Luxembourg, from Germany alone, the Luxembourgs, the Wittelsbachs, and the Habsburgs that are all doing stuff, like especially like in all different areas, but still essentially of the north of Italy. And when no help arrived, because the Luxembourgs did not descend south of the Alps, again, Ponzoni capitulated on July the 15th. Right, so Azzone immediately stationed a strong garrison of infantry and cavalry inside Cremona. There is a lot of fortification going on in the cities. Like, there are castles erected over the main squares that are taken by hostage, as a scholar pointed out at some point. And this is all in parallel with basically the termination of any autonomous communal army activity, and actually however the heavy contributions in money from the cities, which in part is also what this citizenry accepted, because they realized they didn't want to go to war anymore. I mean, it was better to pay the Milanese for hiring some German mercenary that was also effective in defending them. So it's not like these rules were particularly kind, or they weren't iron-fisted or whatever, but they still relied on the communes as living organisms to sustain, in fact, the whole Visconti regime. Throughout 1335, Azzone exploited the profound ecclesiastical schism in common between Archbishop Benedetto da Asinago, appointed by John XXII, and Valeriano Rusca, nominated under imperial authority. When Rusca refused to hand over Lodrisio Visconti, Azzone initially declined to become involved in the internal dispute. After Scaligeri forces attempting to cross the Adda in support of Rusca were blocked by Visconti troops, you see the La Scala are everywhere. They're trying their worst just to gain consensus somewhere. Franchino Rusca renewed his appeals and offered the lordship of common exchange for retention of Bellinzona. Azzone accepted. On July the 25th, he entered Como at the head of an army, installed Benedetto as legitimate archbishop, strengthened the fortifications, and effected a formal reconciliation between the local Guelph and Ghibelline parties as well. This aspect is very fascinating. I mean, the fact that the Visconti lordship managed to bring together like these parties, when you think about it, like the partisan siding once an overlord had come and established peace couldn't simply be at this point. This is due to the exhaustion of the system, as we were talking about before, to continue even the strife between the two sides. When you have Guelphs and Ghibellines siding even against, together with each other against another opponent, may have been Guelph or Ghibelline, but evidently not sort of being that the discriminant. It's a sort of post-Westphalian mentality, as if you exchange partisan fate with sort of confessional one, right? And it's all affirming controls in the Valtellina and all these areas where sort of communes were a bit weaker and archbishops were also more powerful. Shortly afterward, Azzone gained control of Cantu and Lecco, both of which he ordered rebuilt and heavily fortified. You see, always refortification. On July the 28th, he demolished Lodrisio's castle at Crenna near Gallarate and confiscated all separate properties held by the exile. So it was clearing instead those fortifications that could present some sort of problem, as the local clientales and estates sort of could have allowed for some local sort of entrenched resistance. He clears properly the Milanese sort of interland, right, for better control. These incredibly unspeakable rich places. In August, Azzone expelled Temacoldo from Lodi. On October the 18th, he occupied Crema, Caravaggio. Also, this has nothing to do, say, even with Visconti anymore, but I made a video about the Battle of Caravaggio later in the 15th century, and Romano. Fidenza fell again in March 1336. On December the 15th, after a siege lasting 7 months and supported by Piacentine exiles, together with the combined Guelph-Ghibelline Fontana factions, again this Guelph-Ghibelline siding, opposed to Francesco Scotti, that was the local lord. Historically, the Scottis were sort of the de facto lords of Piacenza. Azzone entered the city. So if you look at this on the map as well, that I inserted here at some point, like you realize how compact this domain really is. It's sort of very organic, very rational, right? Contiguous. In April 1337, Mastino della Scala initiated hostilities against Venice. This was a very important battle for the control over the salt mines, because the La Scala had taken over places like Padua, Treviso, and so they were closer to Venice, to the coast. And this is the first moment in which Venice, say, not literally for the first time stepped into the Italian mainland, because there had been other interventions. There's even a crusade waged against Venice because they had started to occupy certain territories in the Este Romagnol coastline. But it's very important because it's basically the first alliance between Florence and Venice against what actually will become Milan as a greater Ghibelline power out there. In this case, it's the La Scala that are threatening both, also in Tuscany. We will talk about that better in a video, similar video to this on Mastino, for example, also in particular Mastino in this case, but also on Cangrande for that matter. And this war is quite interesting because basically Venice and Florence put money in common, and Florence accepts, given that sort of the war is waged next door to Venice itself, as the crow flies, Venice to have the actual military control. Actually, they hire Parmesan, the very famous Parmesan condottiere, that hated the La Scala for different reasons, and the Rossi, and they waged this multi-years war, actually across a pretty small territory, but that was heavily fortified and with canals, and there's a lot of these were all Germans again, and as we'll see, this will be consequential for Milan itself, because at some point the veterans of this war will turn against Milan, and Azzone will really prove there was what he was all about. And so the Azzone promptly. So what was the point here during the war? Instead, is that the La Scala were crumbling. Basically, there's immense multi-city domain that had created into northern and central Italy. It shrinks immediately. I will surely make a video comparing the Visconti and the La Scala signories to show how different their territorial control really was. The La Scala were really weaker in the foundations of power, but in this moment they had managed to extend or even overextend temporarily for a set of political alignments. Verona was not as big as powerful as Milan, so they didn't have the same level of heartland as Lombardy. So it's something very different. And for this very reason, Milan says, okay, well, Florence and Venice are battling against the La Scala. Good, right? We have basically all the major powers here involved against an enemy of mine, at the detriment of this neighbor. And I can strengthen my power in the west and even sort of infiltrating in Tuscany down the line as this war drags on. Or at least it's sort of going to exhaust certain resources. On top of this, there is no escalation against Verona. Like the Milanese could have attacked the La Scala as well, but they want to wait till the end and becoming the tip of the balance then. It was a very clever policy. Azzone, however, promptly convened the Gonzaga, the Este, and other Lombard lords at a congress that resolved to withhold, in fact, any support from Verona and instead to assemble forces for war against Mastino. So there was the idea that this would eventually get to that, but say Lucchino Visconti advanced with 300 Milanese knights, including 40 Barded as his personal guard, to invest Verona, but was forced to withdraw to Mantua after discovering that German mercenaries within his ranks intended to betray him and defect to Mastino on the eve of the scheduled field engagement set for June the 26th. Simultaneously, Azzone arranged the covert introduction of troops into Brescia, that was a Scaligeri. So they don't go full like head on, right? It is interesting that the La Scala here were considering themselves the strongest. They were overly emphasizing their Ghibelline identity as Imperial Vikings, etc., exactly to compete with Milan. There is a bit of an inferiority complex because obviously the Milanese was stronger. So there is a paradox that the Milanese, as you've seen, they also arrange some deals with the papacy. They don't want too many problems. They are Imperial Vikings. They get that at the time of Matteo back in the day, because they need really to fight against a strong Guelph presence. In the moment in which there isn't, like, they don't feel the need to overly emphasize their German identity. After all, they have actually their large German army. They don't feel threat. They don't feel to do anything, right? They are obviously in relatively sort of cordial relations with the imperial authority, but even especially what had happened after the Wittelsbach had sort of captured them, had imprisoned them, had left a scar. And instead, it's a La Scala that, in this moment of crisis and existential threat, overly emphasized the fact that they were imperials and that they were Imperial Vikings, but also the La Scala had all a story connected also with their heraldry of the hound. The Mastino means hound in Italian. Of Can Grande, so great dog, literally, because in heraldry, these canines were not just associated in part with the wolf that had something to do with some northern, especially northeastern Italian, possibly also probably deriving from direct Lombard influence in the region was very strong. As the sort of all the werewolves, the Wolfenars, whatever, all that story, right, of Paul the Diacon talking about the Chinoch heavily back in Germany. But literally because the dog, so the hound, it was loyal, was faithful. In heraldry, was symbolizing loyalty and fealty to, in this case, the emperor. And all these German mercenaries that campaign for the Della Scala are very self-aware, and they constitute the critical core of at least more autonomous German war bands, as opposed to the Visconti they're more powerful, they're more of a state, they have more of an authority and discipline, and know how to control them successfully and better. And so the Visconti do not join the Florentine and the Venetian armies. On the contrary, they try to skirt around and to seize Brescia, that after all had remained Scaligeri. As we've seen, the Scaligers had infiltrated also into Como, the neighboring Como. So that had been a problem, an important wedge to get rid of it. And so Azzone succeeds with this coup in seizing the city. The old and new quarters of the city surrender quickly, although the powerful Rocca, so this is where the citadel, held out until November the 13th. But in any case, Brescia is recaptured. Because in all this, the powerful Scaliger domain is suppressed. It vanishes as the war is threatening Verona itself. We're talking massive armies. We're going to have 3,000-4,000 men-at-arms from both sides. They were telling you how big these armies were. And there is hardly any infantry, or at least there is, but the sources talk ever less about infantry at this point, because probably the social backbone of it had collapsed for footmen, for commoners to be out there. But obviously also those Germans had infantrymen. Every once in a while you hear of that, even though they're almost stereotypically men-at-arms as knights. On September the 29th, by the way, Azzone captured Broni from the Angevin garrison occupying it. In 1339, Lodrisio Visconti, exiled since his arrest in November 1333 on suspicion of conspiracy and subsequent imprisonment in Monza Castle, thereafter finding protection first with the Rusca of Como and later with Mastino II della Scala in Verona, seized the opportunity created by Mastino's discharge of veteran German cavalry after the conclusion of the Venetian-Florentine War. The La Scala lost, so basically maintained just Verona, the surroundings, and so they're resized. The Allies won the war, but there are also all these mercenaries that they didn't know what to do with it. So given that, again, the La Scala hate the Visconti, but they had naturally welcomed one of their exiles, they say, okay, we don't have any wage at this point. When the war is over, we lost to pay these veterans, so we will actually give them a mandate to march on Milan. And this is actually a pretty sort of large amount of angry Teutonic knights that can't wait to plunder the richest city in Europe. So Mastino initially covered their wages. Lodrisio organized them into, so there was a minimum thereof, and all other powers were somehow playing into this sustainability of this force. Lodrisio organized them into the Company of St. George under Raymond of Guyver, that is known as Malerba, Konrad von Landau, that will also be, in fact, a famous soldier of fortune later on, Werner von Urslingen. These are very, like, this was enemy of fate, enemy of God, enemy of mercy, right? So, these are names that appear at this point will become more famous in the 1340s, 50s, 60s. This was an impressive force. These guys are scary, by the way. There's a very, I must say this, there's an anecdote, because when the war is over, the problem of the German mercenaries presents itself also for the Venetians and the Florentines. That, by the way, don't want to pay these guys. And the Florentines are far away. The Venetians are in their lagoon, so they can simply think, okay, let's simply disband them. But in fact, some of these soldiers will actually pass, paradoxically, to the defeated. Let's say, so I understand how complicated it is. And in that moment, there is Ludwig of Bavaria that lived long, as you know, and sort of popped up in the scene because there is this big table of peace where all this matter has to be settled, like in the aftermath of the war, and he acts as the leader of the Germans, as obviously Holy Roman Emperor and everything, and basically and ask like the Florentine, I mean, everybody telling you to sort of consider that their German mercenaries, after all, were under him, because he was actually. Naturally, there was not a good blood running between the Florence. It was the most black wealth power ever, and hated, in the sense, any kind of imperial authority in meddling their affairs. So basically, the Florentine ambassador simply tell Ludwig to go blip himself, and this is so beautiful. I mean, they literally didn't say that, but sort of their response was kind of nuts, sort of Bastogne style. Also because he literally had no power in that context, or really it was more like emerging as an hour, as a benevolent German father toward whom all his German children had to flock, right? But these German children are actually something else. There's this roughly 2,500 to 3,000 heavy cavalry, 800 infantry, and 200 crossbowmen. You see here, naturally, I think it's a big question, because there are some conducted documents at this point that still have to be researched in archives, but what you get easily from narrative sources is that while infantry is constantly named in the first decades of the century, like 2 decades later, you never basically hear of them, or you hear these small contingents over, I mean, just hundreds of infantrymen versus thousands of cavalrymen. This is very interesting. And these guys, as we've seen, are dangerous. And there are many. These are massive army. On February the 9th, Lodrizio heads towards Milan. He crosses the Adda at Rivolta, routing Pinalla Liprandi's frontier guard, by the way, who abandoned the line without fighting because this was too big of a force. Then devastated the Brescian and Bergamasque countrysides before entering the Seprio, and you're basically into the Milanese, where he exacted overdue tribute to pay his troops that, by the way, were there for a reason, right? So to say. The resulting abandonment of fields and mills caused acute food shortages in the same Milan. So this was a veritable threat to the vital resources, probably to the logistical lifeline and supply system of the communes. It was, by the way, an incredibly sophisticated system, and also at the same time a relatively vulnerable one, when big enough armies could come to sort of station undisturbed there. So this was a very, very delicate situation. Milan could have simply been taken and sacked at that point, because even though Lodrizio was a Visconti still, his German soldiers didn't care at all about the locals. Azzone by then severely considered that these were veterans of some of the most gruesome battles and wars of the era, right? So they had been in camps for years, seeing and doing atrocious things. I mean, they were mentally probably somewhere else, right? And we get actually from, you would think that it's the barbarian stereotype, but actually chronicles are pretty eloquent. It would be a very interesting anthropological research to do for that matter, in describing this German knights as incredibly, like, all the brutal stereotype of these hot-headed, unruly, violent, rough, like, so it's very interesting, because actually the Italians considered themselves more disciplined and cold-blooded than the Germans. So there is a lot of very interesting literature about this. And I never really made videos about the stereotypes between different countries and different peoples, but there were also among the same Germans, north versus south, all this kind of things, that they're very pronounced. Also politically, ecclesiastically, these mercenaries had an opinion. We rarely hear their voices, and we understand they were alienated, because differently from other places, these guys were not to settle down in Italy, for example. They all ended their lives either fighting there or coming back to Germany. So it's very interesting to see how the Italians actually, even during the later, probably more intense age of free companies, that here is kind of at the beginning of, here the one of St. George is one of them, actually maintain control in all. There was not really this anarchic, like, all groups, companies coming from everywhere, and nobody sort of simply being able to stop it. It was actually some Italians were throwing them at each other, and they had also very powerful leagues that eventually expelled some of them. At a point, the Great Company in the 40s, for example, has an incredibly interesting military history in that regard of Italian political background that gets often sort of overshadowed by other narratives. But in any case, the situation with the Company of St. George was very serious, and Azzone, by then severely crippled by gout, which was all very frequent in sort of the world of the time, a bit for sort of general sanitary precautions, a bit the kind of diet, and just thinking about the strains of a lifetime, as we've seen here, spent fighting, kept a garrison of 700 to 800 cavalry only inside Milan under Giovanni Visconti for urban defense, while delegating field command to Lucchino. Naturally, Milan was complicated to seize, to say the least, but in fact, their forces and only Milan could afford such large ones, counted an army of 3,500 heavy cavalry, predictably and ironically themselves in large proportion German, 2,000 crossbowmen and 14,000 infantry. This is interesting because this popular presence, right? This was mostly recruited from the rural populations. They were admittedly just peasants, and they weren't particularly important. But there is also a popular participation to the ensuing battle, that is the one of Parabiago, that is incredibly bloody, and it's been defined as the swan song of the Milanese communal army, because they basically fielded for the last time, so to say, or in any meaningful fashion, at least in scale, a communal force as opposed probably to a professional, a mercenary one, right? And so you have this passage from the communal era to the one of the free companies. But Azzone was particularly seeking for help also outside, among his many allies in the surroundings. Coalition partners sent, because if Milan fell there, or there was any major destabilization, everybody would have felt the consequences of that for years. And so coalition partners sent immediate reinforcement. The Este, that were, as we've seen there, sort of still very connected with the Milanese, sent these forces under Brandalizio da Marano. There were troops from the Marquis of Saluzzo, forces from Louis II of Vaud, and the Count Aimo of Savoy, soldiers from the Marquis of Montferrat, auxiliaries from Taddeo de Pepoli of Bologna as well, the Gonzaga and Genoa, among others. On February 21st, amid a violent snowstorm, Lodrizio launched a dawn surprise assault against Parabiago, a town northwest of Milan. The Milanese vanguard, 800 cavalry and 2,000 infantry under Giovannolo di Vercellino Visconti and Giovanni Fieschi, suffered heavy initial losses. Many soldiers remained asleep in makeshift encampments ill-suited to prolonged resistance in such conditions. Fighting continued with great ferocity for several hours. Lucchino's main body engaged. Lucchino himself was unhorsed, wounded, stripped of armor, and tied to a walnut tree. Reinforcements arriving from Milan, specifically 300 Savoyards led by Hector from Panigo, together with Ferrares and Brandalizio da Marano, found Lodrizio's men dispersed in plunder. At that point, attacked with determination and completed their rout. Lodrizio was captured along with his sons, Ambrogio and Giannotto. Malerba, the head of the Germans, surrendered at the Olona ford, and little note, Malerba actually took a vow after this defeat, and in order to fulfill it, to resolve it, went over to the crusade in Smyrna, Turkey, where he found his death, by the way. Losses reached approximately 3,000 dead on each side. This was one of the single bloodiest battles ever, as we see. Not even the crushing Ghibelline victory at Zappolino had been so bloody. And considering this was also fought properly between men at arms, so it was particularly intense. Lucchino knighted several participants directly on the field, including Antonio, who was the legitimate son of Matteo Visconti, who captured a German standard, as well as Giovanni Scaccabarozzi of Milan, Protasio Caimi, Giovannolo da Monza, Reginaldo de Sandris of Mantua. These are all just different names. Lucio Vistarini of Lodi, and Inviziati of Alessandria, Giovanni Fieschi of Genoa, the Piacentines, Lancillotto Anguissola, Don Dacio Malvicini de Fontana, and Omodeo de Spectenis, together with certain Teutonic knights of their own, among them Sfolcus the Melic. And we have this sort of Italianate versions of their names. We're not more precisely informed of what their names were. The battle featured multiple distinct phases. Initial surprise dawn assaults, exploding snow and disarray, main morning clash where Lucchino's Germans initially prevailed but were overstretched, temporary Visconti collapse with Lucchino captured, and final reversal by fresh allied cavalry, especially Savoyard and Ferrarese contingents that exploited Lodrisio's troops dispersing for plunder, making it, again, one of the bloodiest and also most complex engagements to reconstruct of Azzone's rule. It's not even entirely clear how everything happened on this battlefield that, in fact, had barely anything to do with the one of the battles previously fought, where you had, we've seen it before, essentially multiple battle lines in depth, clashing against one another, could be a flank attack by a hidden reserve. Here, it was probably more orderly than we imagine it, say from a sort of military logical point of view, but reconstructing it is incredibly difficult to realize. Visibility was reduced, terrain was infamous, really, and so you have all a series of, like, including the dismounted men-at-arms that assault the enemy barracks, like, you know, at dawn, like all these kind of strange issues. But you also have, in fact, enemies attacking, so finding each other like in asymmetric positions and therefore falling on the enemy rear. Finally, from Lucchino's side, again, Azzone was not in command, but this ranks as a battle and extraordinary victory in his political guidance, and so to his credit. Chroniclers noted the confusion caused by both sides using German contingents under the Visconti Biscione and Imperial Eagle banners as well. Very interesting set of heraldic figures, with the snow turning the field into knee-deep drifts that hindered mobility and amplified casualties. We'll have to make a video on the story of the Biscione, as a matter of fact, that, as you know, is also present on the Alfa Romeo EQ, so to say. And it's obviously after Milan, after the Visconti dynasty, and that's obviously a snake that sort of eats a man. So it's a symbol of chthonic challenge, a bit like the black dragon that Otto IV of Brunswick used at the Battle of Bouvines. Apparently, the venom, slaying the dragon, right, that is in us, so scaring people. Like the future Philip VI, Philip of Valois, had marched here. We haven't seen it because Azzone was not yet in charge or fighting, but at the beginning of the 20s, it was particularly impressed by this banner and the Milanese army that marched against him, because the French literally at some point tried to attack Milan from France, probably from the Valois, and they stopped in front of this army and they sort of made peace and came back. And from there on, Philip maintained this sort of idea of this Milanese host. It was incredible because Villani tells us that the French, following the sort of the stereotype of the Franks coming to Italy and crushing the Longobards, etc., they would see the latter as these Italians always sort of shutting themselves inside their own cities, right? So being vile, not wanting to fight as the Carolingians. And the idea of the snail that withdraws into its own shell was associated with, in fact, the Longobards, at least in that French view mostly. And when they saw the Biscione, the snake, the viper of Milan, the French initially thought that it was the snail, this is just an anecdote. And so the fact that eventually the French were beaten by this name, I had to come back home without a fight even, was sort of a funny way, like from the Italian side, to show off, let's say, and to prove, like to continue along the jokes with a sort of a lesson to their neighbors. And the eagle banners were everywhere. In all of this, because there is a very interesting context. We talk about the Scaligers, Parma. There's a very beautiful literature there regarding the fact that both sides at some point wanted to claim a Ghibelline background, right? When the Parmesans were fighting against the Scaliger siege in the 30s of the 14th century, they were Ghibellines, and they thought of themselves. There is all this idea of the Germans properly in service of Parma. There were many Germans, as we've seen, in service of the Scaligers too, but that were being celebrated. They were blessed in arms before battle with their swords on the altars. The local lord controlled them. And there was this idea that the empire, the eagle symbolism, was all the true one. The true Ghibelline and pro-imperial side was actually the one fighting against the La Scala there, were understood as sort of false ones. So everybody wanted to have that prerogative. And here the Visconti, indeed, in this battle show that essentially the system Milan, so to say, is superior to these free companies. Like Milan withstands properly the test of time, of an era, right, of warfare with this battle at a great cost, as you understand here, with all the blood spilled on the snow, but still effectively. And so that is in great part also Azzone's legacy here. In fact, Azzone died in Milan on August the 16th of 1339 at 37 years of age, overwhelmed by the gradual complications of the aforementioned gout, from which he had suffered for years by that point. So imagine what this meant as a whole. Again, he's a young man. If you see also his tomb that I also modeled the AI thumbnail on quite in detail. Like it's these people died young, but died young out of probably also psychophysical exhaustion, considering what kind of life they had. I mean, the entire burden of the entire Milanese domain on your shoulders, fighting all life, participating to those battles, clashing, like I was seen at Alto Pascio directly with the spearhead of the Guelph man. I mean, it's and even taking a lot of beatings here and there. Like it seems, I didn't say it before, but at Alto Pascio, at least there is a narrative that says that the Visconti were broken at the first encounter, at least because they were fighting against the so-called Territorial. It was complicated, but it's just a voice. It might have not been true because, sources are vague in this. But in general, it was a gamble. It was a constant gamble to live like this. And yet, we owe to Azzone, in his military lifestyle, that was in part obscured by his heirs because they wanted to show him that it was a bit like a Pacific ruler, all that kind of stuff, for their own political reason. Needing peace at a certain point is also a major narrative of the affirmation of the Visconti regime. Actually, he was the one who built the core, what will essentially remain the Milanese original state through these wars. Azzone left no legitimate male heir, only the natural daughter Lucina, who later married Lucolo del Zotta, and a succession passed without contest to uncles Lucino and Giovanni. And that's another era, we'll talk about it, where in the 40s and the 50s, now, in the course of his 10-year rule, Azzone effected this therefore crucial transformation of the Visconti lordship from a precarious communal regime constantly threatened by imperial and papal intervention to a militarily dominant regional principality. And I stress militarily here, right? This achievement rested upon a succession of rapid multi-front campaigns that overwhelmed fragmented opposition upon pragmatic alliances that routinely transcended, as we've seen, the conventional Guelph-Ghibelline divide, upon the extensive and effective employment of German professional cavalry that ensured battlefield superiority even against numerically comparable forces, upon the systematic construction and reinforcements of fortifications within subjected cities to impose internal order and visibly asserting seigneurial dominance, and upon the sustained mobilization of Milan's exceptional demographic weight, estimated at close to 200,000 inhabitants by the middle of the century, together with its unparalleled economic resources to underwrite an apparatus capable of conducting prolonged operations throughout Lombardy despite the relatively limited scale of the Allied urban contingents. And so we have this essential transition accomplished under Azzone from the former, say, the vestiges at that point of what was, however, present still, as we've seen also for Parabiago, of the Milanese communal army, to the sort of steamrolling war machine that would, in the following decades, actually manage to threaten even central Italy and to almost unite, in fact, the Italic kingdom in under a single royal crown, which literally the Visconti were accused of seeking to, and they were absolutely doing. And that was, in a sense, also the older Italic crown and Longobard crown that the Milanese had de facto controlled, with Monza, with Pavia, the older sort of Longobard legacy of, say, if you can become Holy Roman Emperor only if you control the Italic crown. So this is important also from a Ghibelline perspective in the Holy Roman Empire at the time, because it shows you how really tied to an idea of sort of knightly imperial, but you understand there's a lot of this resurgent as well in certain symbolism during the crisis of the mid-14th century, and that is not merely a sort of a way of saying. So I'm really glad to have added this piece of information, because I felt, again, like the Milanese warfare is radically underrated, and people just think of sort of certain sort of names, sort of the here, like of the fact that, yeah, there is something to it. But when it comes to this age in particular, it all sort of almost vanishes, lost in the details of many names, and people do not have like, but how did it happen? Why did it happen, right? So on Schwerpunkt, we tend essentially to answer these questions, right? To give that picture and to sort of recompose really a frame is really incredibly complicated, as you understand today. We really need 2 hours to explain what happened in this lifetime of not even 2 decades of personal warfare, right, and 10 years of direct rule that probably most of you have never heard of. At least this is something that you really have to be specifically interested in, to also get passionate about, and at the same time to have a lot of background on other aspects to be familiar with, because you can also learn the story, but without context, it's all a bit difficult. And that's why I'm making lots of videos. I am spoiling this, really. I have one on Castruccio and one on Henry VII. And so we'll have to talk about the wars of the Lombard League, that perhaps, at least in terms of popular vibe, are probably the most missed, like in the second half of the 12th and in the first half of the 13th century. There's really a lot to cover in that, right? And recently also started a kind of a series on 13th century warfare for different countries in Europe. But there isn't obviously just the Holy Roman Empire. We have to be a bit more all round. And I think we are doing a fairly good job. And as I was saying at the beginning, if I look at medieval Milanese warfare, it's too few. Like if I say Milan, medieval Milan, we have 16 videos, but let's say a good part are, well, there is something, like they're not terrible videos, but again, they are too scattered considering the density of Milanese. There should be something like at least double by this point. And also medieval Milanese warfare is incredibly stuck here, just 5 videos, this is the 6th. And again, we did something, but it completely, like what we've done doesn't properly render the idea of anything that we have to much more clearly observe here with other videos. But I'm glad, again, as I said in the past days and weeks, that the channel is doing particularly well for some reason. Recently, it would be great if we managed to plateau instead at 4,000, 3,500 in 48 hours, 5,000 in 48 hours. And, that would be a great step up. I have lots of new subscribers, so it's all fairly new and fairly consistent with a picture of sort of breakthrough, algorithmically speaking. More and more people are aware of what we're doing. The content is also objectively becoming better to an extent where at least I've sort of, also in terms of topic, tended to intersperse more specials, more ad hoc design topic, like this one, for example. And it's very complicated at this point to explain how to balance the themes, right? But I think that a video like this explains a lot concerning why these topics are important, why we're covering them. So I will be watching this. I will be naturally very attentive to cover as much as we can. And then we have always the cycle that accompanies us in the choice. Have in the next few days, like we have sort of interesting stuff to cover as well. Military stuff, very interesting military stuff. We have 6 warfare videos in a row, so it's a lot of warfare. I mean, really a lot of warfare. Actually, more, 7, 8, at least 8. Right, so it's all warfare. There's admittedly something in between at first, the next one I make tomorrow about the Byzantines, but hey, this is, there's really a lot of stuff, and I'm really glad that the channel turned out the way it did, because this is not to be given for granted the way it is. Like, it's, it could also be other things. It could also be a matter of a very different topic and content, and I'm glad that at least we have the support now. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.